Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited about Benjamin Riley's talk afterwards, so we're going to start on time so we can get out on time and see that. My name is Fletcher-Wood.
Yeah, I'm Nick Rose.
And we are 2/3 of Teach First's knowledge development team, which is a small bit in the research department. And we both have books out. You can buy mine downstairs. Don't think John Capp.
Available on Amazon.
Available on Amazon. Nick's is but it's got nothing to do with the presentation, so we'll say no more about that. So today we're going to be looking at what we called, when we had to agree a session title, Meeting the Challenge, the Experience of Schools Serving Areas of Greatest Need. Basically, this is where I've spent half of the last year, and Nick, since he joined the team earlier this year, spent a lot of his time in 5 communities around England and Wales, and talk a little bit about them. This is a Teach First's underlying purpose. For any of you who saw Brett or Sam earlier, you may have heard a little bit about this already. And the interesting thing is that in London, as we know, this link between how much you earn, how much your parents earn, and what you achieve in life is much weaker than it was 10 years ago. My favourite, loads of statistics around it, my favourite one is that there are 2 boroughs in London in which pupils with free school meals and pupils who do not receive free school meals go to university in equal proportions, which are Islington and Westminster. And sure, they probably still go to different universities and so on. It's nowhere near fair, but there are other parts of the country which are nowhere near achieving that at the moment. And that has become a problem for Teach First, that has become a problem for the country as a whole. And about a year and a half ago, I was sitting with colleagues saying, well, you know, what should our main objective study be next year? And one of the questions that came up and stuck was, what are all these places like? And I don't mean that flippantly, because lots of people live and teach all over the country and write about it. But our feeling was there wasn't a huge amount of knowledge about what was actually going on in schools, and that if Teach First wanted to be more involved in life outside London, we needed to develop that knowledge both internally and externally. So this project was born, and we looked for 5 kinds of area. And I think we probably started off looking this way because of the rhetoric around coastal and rural areas. So you know, we need to know what life is like in coastal areas and rural areas and so on. So we wanted somewhere that was coastal, we wanted somewhere that was urban, we wanted somewhere that's in Wales, because Teach First operates in Wales and that's primarily a very different policy area. And then we were going to go to somewhere rural, and I did a bit of investigative digging, and I came back and I said, rural isn't a problem. Since then, other research has come out that maybe makes you question that. But people living in rural areas are disproportionately richer than the national average. And there are very, very few young people living there. That's not to say there isn't poverty in some of these areas. That's not to say it's not an issue. But we came up with another area called hinterland, which it's kind of where you drive through on your way outside a big city. So what we noticed were there are lots of areas like North Tyneside and Wolverhampton that are right next to big urban centres, are very closely linked to them, but still seem to have quite big achievement gaps. So hinterland, and then comparison. We want to look at somewhere where this link between poverty and education attainment seemed to be broken a little bit. So we looked at all these different kinds of data, starting off with attainment, then looking at various deprivation indices, and we came up with 5 places that we went to. These are they. Please put your hand up if you can guess where the 5 places we went to. Go ahead. Top right is the centre of Wolverhampton. Are you from Wolverhampton?
Unfortunately, yes.
And therein you have the challenge in a response. Thank you very much, Chris.
Yes, no, I think the top left is Blackpool.
The top left is Blackpool.
Yeah,
You can
the
see
tower,
that.
towers
Only 3 left. Got about 70, 80 people. Go ahead.
Bottom left one, is that Balamory?
It's not, but it does. It's not. I cheated on this one actually because there's a massive medieval edifice here. If I put that in, I was like, well, that'd be obvious because everyone knows this particular castle. So that's the edge of the wall. So that is the town of Caerphilly, and you've got these beautiful green hills that you go off into. 2 remaining places. Rotherham, you're on the right lines. This is, well, I don't know if I can say that. This is East Leeds. That is the express bus that goes through Seacroft between Leeds and Bradford. And this is Hackney. And what I like about this is you've got this little like pit pub by the canal, and you've got all the social housing behind it. So those are the 5 places that we chose to go to. So we looked at all the data, we shortlisted to 3 in each category. Then we just wrote to people and said, where do you think would be a good idea? So, for example, wrote to Laura and said, where do you think it would be a good idea for different coastal areas? And she was like, well, Blackpool would be good. You can talk to Stephen Tierney and he'll help you. He's an executive head there, which turned out to be true. So, who did we talk to? My other 3rd colleague, who's not here today, totted everything up this week. He said, we've talked to 361 people over the preceding year, which, you know, if you're a secondary school head teacher, you probably talk to more people than that in a week. But that's pretty intense given that we had to set up, arrange consent forms, visit and interview, and then transcribe and then analyse all of this data. And so the point to make here is, I would have loved to do loads and loads of focus groups and really get under the skin of each area. But for each of them, we've got a pretty good sample. We've been to 3, 4, 5 schools. We've got a sense that it's not just we've been to a school and got the picture of what's going on in that school. The other thing to say about this, and I've blogged about this, is this was a bit of a nightmare. Getting into schools to talk about things like this is really difficult. And we were conned, because Stephen Tierney was so helpful, Blackpool was really easy. You can see we managed to have 97 people, and it was pretty easy. Everything after that got harder and harder. And Nick put in the notes that we should probably call out our thanks to everyone who was interviewed for this at this point. So we held semi-structured interviews and focus groups, and we had 3 big areas of question. One of them was basically, what's the area like? What's it like growing up around here? How would you describe it? The second one was to do with education and opportunities, that kind of thing. And then the 3rd one was to do with relationships, who can help them, and so on. We then went through an analysis process using the Aviva piece of software and sort of worked through it, edited, drafted, came up with some answers. And the big question, if you cut it down to one thing, it's like, is it all the same? Is it all different? If you're training a teacher for Hackney, is that the same as you're training them for Blackpool? Or is there something unique about Blackpool that overpowers that? And that is what we're going to go through next. And Nick's going to talk us through the similarities.
Very much. Yeah, so we're going to talk through some of the similarities and distinctive features that came out of the qualitative analysis for each area. We're going to start with some similarities and bit of interaction here. That's why I kind of encourage people sitting in the front. Can everyone read that? You've all got excellent eyesight. That's fantastic. Have a quick read of that and then ask the person next to you, what do you think the first major similarity you found across all the areas of race C are? Okay, so this is an illustrative quote, so you can work out what that is. Ask the person next to you. Okay? I can tell by the level of noise that you've finished. Alright, Hands up on this. Anyone got any ideas? What do you think the first kind of major theme might be?
Single parent families?
Not quite. It is related to families.
Parents have a negative view of school because of their own experience.
It's kind of related to that. It's a slightly broader theme than that. One last guess.
Moving around?
Huh?
Moving around a lot?
Moving around a lot. Actually, again, that might factor into it. In fact, one of the first really big factors we found that was really common across all 5 of the areas that we looked at was who do young people look up to? And there's actually quite a great deal of independent research over a number of years pointing in the same direction as our interviews identified. But young people look up to members of their family, particularly their parents. And so this idea that they're kind of influenced heavily by celebrities and things like that, well, we did get a few mention non-family members, but typically the kinds of things they mentioned was about their success and their talent. We even had one sixth former mention John Locke, because of his role in the Declaration of American Independence and the Constitution and things like that. So it wasn't like the quick fix fame. That was the real kind of thing we were looking at. In fact, caring and resilience as well was a really kind of admired factor that lots of young people talked about. They talked about the struggles that they say that their mum or their dad had but achieving success despite that adversity. And this was a really common across all of the 5 areas. And one of the things from our literature review of this as well is that in terms of what you might take away from this is thinking about how you're talking to students about aspirations, because it's quite unlikely that generic approaches to raising aspirations will have the impact that you want. We tend to operate through what we might call hot knowledge, through personal connections. And obviously we can see the advantages of that for perhaps people whose family have been to university and have those kind of professional understanding of the world. As your role model, you're going to have all of that advantage. But how can we create that personal, identifiable connection in terms of the information and the sort of aspirations that we're trying to build for young people? Okay, so here's another quote. And again, there's 2 here to make it a bit easier for you. I reckon as it's the afternoon after lunch. Have a look at those and see if you can think what the common facts are might be. Sort of people standing up in the back. Can you see at all, Martin? No? Okay, so the first one's a student talking about having to make a choice between doing well in school and having friends. And in the bottom one, it's actually a secondary school teacher talking in Wolverhampton, Walsall, saying that actually it's not kids thinking that they're going to leave school and do nothing. It's kids kind of thinking that they'll go work for their dads, like cash in hand. It's a kind of an easy answer. So, does anyone have any ideas as to what the second major factor we think we've identified across the work areas might be?
Aspiration.
There you go. Whoever said that didn't put their hand up, so I can't take it. Okay, well, you're absolutely right, it is. But every school, pretty much every teacher almost, talks about aspirations and student aspirations a lot. What was very interesting is that where teachers and school leaders were talking about aspirations, in fact, when you were asking kids about what they wanted to do in the future, none of them were saying, oh, golden goal. Many of them were talking about professional careers. And even going down to primary school, you've got kids saying, oh, I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a teacher. However, the range of options that students talk about seems to be quite narrow. And so when you ask them about how will you achieve these things, what support, who will support you to achieve these things, then children became rapidly less clear. And again, it comes a bit back to those personal connections, where some of them would talk about family connections. Oh, well, my dad's an architect, so I can find out what I need to do from him. Whereas for other children, it was really deeply unclear. Well, my teachers might do something. The other thing really was that lots of students were really deeply critical of careers advice, in terms of many of them complained about bias particularly the pressure on sixth forms at the moment, sort of feeling that they're being perhaps elbowed into particular courses, or being shoved into BTECs if there was, not being given a fighting chance on their A-levels. But one of the real kind of things that perhaps came out of the literature review is it's not just a case of aspirations. Certainly some students may have low aspirations, but many of them have quite high aspirations. They've just no idea how to really make those real. And in terms of career advice, I mean, real takeaway points is how impartial is it? And is it coming early enough in the system to really, for those students who don't have those family connections, to give them that hot knowledge into these routes? What's there really to replace it? Okay, we'll play this game one more time just to annoy Martin at the back. Did you see a common link? So you desperately try to read it. Maybe I should have read it now. Okay, anyone got an idea what the next factor might be?
That there's lots of barriers for parents to children.
Excellent, parental engagement. And again, in all of the areas of greatest need that we visited, a huge amount of hand-wringing and concern and kind of, where's the good ideas about how to reach sort of hard-to-reach parents? How do we engage with parents? So, I mean, lots of barriers come out, and there is literature on this as well. Some of the barriers obviously are perhaps the parent's own experience of school that can sometimes set up quite negative sort of attributions towards school or priority of school within family life. But also, talking to some of the parents, just genuine practical financial difficulties in terms of being able to engage with school, or the feeling that they didn't really have the knowledge to support their student. It might be fine, I could help them at primary school, kind of coming into secondary, I don't really know what I'm doing. What's difficult, again, looking at the literature, in terms of evidence-based approaches, in terms of improving parental engagement, there isn't really very much. Nothing's been really rigorously evaluated on that. So the takeaway point really is, can you systematically try and identify the barriers that exist and then start trying to tackle those barriers and try and kind of like just remove them one at a time if possible to try and increase the opportunities for parents to be able to engage with the school. Okay, so the next one. Any guesses? Yeah, I talked a great amount about teacher retention and turnover, and we kind of broadly categorise that into both the pros and the cons of the kind of accountability culture we have. In terms of some of the pros, where they were described, things like a real emphasis on trying to improve the CPD offer in schools was one of the things that came out of it. Certainly a great focus on student attainment, and in many schools which had seen improvements in their attainment, they had related that back in their perceived link to the fact that there was this accountability culture. And parents and students that we talked to were talking about, like 3 or 4 years ago, the results were really bad, but they're really moving in the right direction with the new head teacher or the new school or the new academy. However, there was a very strongly perceived link to high teacher turnover. And we certainly know that in areas of the country that do serve sort of lower socioeconomic groups, that there does tend to be a higher teacher turnover, and those teachers tend to go and work in more affluent areas and schools that are performing better. So it is a genuine problem, and certainly where recruitment is a challenge, the combination of difficulty recruiting and high turnover is potentially creating very difficult problems for those schools. But also the fact that school reputations are quite slow to change. Parents may have gone to that school 10, 15, 20 years ago, sort of like have a model of what it was like. And so even if the school really has tried to turn around what it's doing, often the community doesn't really buy into that. They still have this kind of view. Well, it's got better, but I wouldn't necessarily send my kid there. So it kind of underlines really the challenge for school leaders. clearly communication of that kind of high challenge, but really trying to do something about reducing the sort of the, if you like, perception of threat in order to be able to kind of make the CPD more effective. Okay, this last one from me. What do you think the last one might be? Complete waste of mass in the back. Any ideas? I've massively overgone my time, Harry, so you have to use about 2 minutes.
Support and infrastructure around funds, all the other things that go with it.
Yeah, it's kind of, we kind of sort of said it's kind of like the joined up services sort of stuff. So in areas where there was kind of felt to be quite a joined up sense of services around young people, what was interesting, parents and school workers could readily name organisations that were kind of connecting up, you know, sort of youth work and health and social care, and it was certainly perceived as having a positive impact. But certainly in terms of SEND, and certainly CAMS came up time and time again as areas where there were widespread concerns about funding and also concerns about the integration really with the work of schools. Okay, so I'll hand it to Harry. Well, this is the summary there. I'll take up the
We can share all the slides. Yeah, so Nick got to see the similarity because he did a lot of the analysis work. I got to see the differences because I went to all of the different visits. But I think it is worth pulling out what makes these different communities special. So one at a time, Blackpool, it's easy to sort of caricature this, and I do feel that some of the reporting thus far approaches that. And at the same time, it would be inaccurate not to say that there are a range of social problems concentrated in this one place. For example, a high transient population. We heard a lot from people like head teachers saying you have people who've really struggled in Manchester or even in Glasgow who come to Blackpool for a fresh start because it has associations as a holiday town for them. With that, you get quite a lot because of this transience and because also of the nightlife. This is a town that was once a fairly sort of classy holiday destination, and then with the growth of package tours has become a day, stag, hen-do nightlife destination. You see a lot of things that I don't think should be, that you would see on the high street, maybe in many English towns, but that kids experience all around them a lot of the time and it becomes normalised, so drugs, alcohol. And then with that, low-paid work, which a teacher, inclusion coordinator, described as a dangerous distraction. Kids can get cash in hand work over the summer on the pier, and then they're like, well, I'm not going to bother going into a college course. So that was probably the biggest thing that really stood out about Blackpool. East Leeds was fascinating because we went to just, you know, typical outsiders, look at this map and you're like, well, it's all in the top decile of the indices of multiple deprivation, i.e. it's all in the top 10% of the poorest areas in the country. Let's go and find out what that particular sub-area is like. And you get there and you realise there's a dividing line right down the middle and you've got two completely different communities. There's a more inner city area called Hare Hills, which the Office of National Statistics describes as being primarily populated by multicultural metropolitan people. That is to say, it's 35% white British, you have a lot of people who are first and second generation, a lot of people from Southeast Asia now, a lot of people from Eastern Europe coming in. Although it looks just as poor on national data, the educational culture there is completely different. And so we talked to one head, fascinatingly, who'd worked in both places, both Hare Hills and Seacroft, and he was describing that it takes a long time to get to know the culture in Hare Hills, and things are very, very private, whereas in Seacroft you have this idea of wearing things on your sleeve, a badge of honour, and this is a much more, what the ONS would call hard-pressed living in constrained city dweller communities, what some of the people we interviewed described as white working class communities. And the value, even though results are fairly similar, the results are at a similar level for very different reasons. In the white working class community, we are hearing about parents not valuing education, or perhaps having had really poor experiences of education themselves, or not knowing how to support their children, stuff Nick was talking about earlier. Whereas in Hare Hills, we're hearing the barriers are completely different. They're to do with EAL, they're to do with understanding the English school system. Wolverhampton and Walsall, I think my favourite thing about Wolverhampton and Walsall was being, though I say so myself, proved right. Like, hinterland is a thing. These areas that you drive through to get from A to B are, I think, a distinct sort of geographical category. If there are any geography teachers in the room, you may be able to put a name on that for me. We heard a lot about the comparisons with Birmingham and people saying, even though it's 20 minutes on the tram, it's completely different here. What you get in the city centre, the opportunities, and trying to understand how much are young people accessing those opportunities. There's amazing stuff going on in Birmingham. Are they going there? Grammar school system. I probably don't need to say anything more about grammar schools. Really, I think current, but lots of the heads are saying it's a nightmare. We're getting people creamed off. It really affects our intake. All the stuff that we know means grammar schools wreck societies. Right, let's teach their official position so I can say that. Reduced collaboration across the city, again, as part of this fragmentation. Difficulty turning around reputation, Nick's talked about a little bit before. Intense accountability pressure. We'll cover that. Wales, again, was fascinating as someone who's only taught in the English school system. Schools felt much more communal. We talked to a lot of teachers who'd been in the same place for 10, 15 years. My favourite anecdote was the head teacher who was talking about how she was doing on her 5-year plan and how she had a year ill, so she was only 2 years into the 5-year plan. You don't, and I talk to a lot of head teachers, you very rarely hear them talking about 5-year plans. Some of them have got it, but mostly their priorities are much sooner than that. At the same time, so on that level, South Wales looked like a lovely place to work. At the same time, you can look at the results, and PISA shows us they are a little bit lower. Job insecurity, talked to one parent, like, oh, what jobs do people do around here? Wales, like, what jobs are there? And this is an ongoing, we were interviewing in Port Talbot as well at this time, just at the time the threat was over the steelworks, and talking to kids who are like, I don't know what's going to happen to my dad, and there's nothing else in town if things go wrong. And then this idea of a different national education system developing, so they've got their own qualifications, own curricula coming through, and Wales increasingly diverging from the English system. Hackney, gentrification, intense concerns around housing, diverse cultural knowledge required of teachers, particularly parents were quite insistent about that. Parents concerned about stereotypes of Hackney, at the same time saying, we are concerned about crime, we are concerned about gangs. And then the London effect, really high accountability. My favourite quotation from the whole lot, I think it was a parent who said, the school used to be about cycling. Hackney is very proud of its cycling reputation. They all do their cycling proficiency, and now it's about learning. And then with that, talking to parents and TAs who are saying, you're getting through in a primary school 3 teachers in a year. But they can, it seems, at the moment, keep doing that in a way that Blackpool would not be able to. Final thought, and we'll have a bit of time for questions, which is good. The London effect, is it just more money? Probably not. There are things that are not replicable outside London. You cannot replicate having how many universities we've got in London, the number of jobs that are available, this pool of young teachers throwing themselves into school and getting beaten up and then heading off 5 years later. Beaten up by the accountability, not by the kids, obviously. And you can't necessarily replicate that outside London. But there are things that we could do, like this idea of joined-up services, like some of the things Nick was talking about of role models, thinking about cultural capital, thinking about who are we introducing, what role models are we introducing young people to that are relatable, that I think would transfer outside London. The first paper about Blackpool is up on our website, and has been for a very long time. Second paper about Leeds should be up soon, and the remainder will all go there. If you have questions you want to email us about, you can email us, or if you have questions you want to speak about. But that gives us about 10 minutes for questions to rattle through, so please fire away.
Do you think you've seen the same, where there was the similarities, might you've seen the same similarities in areas that are not of greatest need?
Quite possibly, although that wasn't part of the study, so as a researcher I can't really comment. In terms of literature review though, obviously we have gone through and looked at the kind of elements we found and kind of what other researchers found as well. So for instance, things like role models, if I can be pretty certain on that. Some of the questions about when should we be doing career advice and how impartial is it? Pretty certain that's pretty global. It's more difficult when you kind of get up to the other areas. Some of them were more sort of contrasting. Okay, so when you talk about sort of joined up services, in some areas people were talking about these kind of organisations that link together very readily. In other areas, they were talking about the kind of problems of this group not communicating with that group. Now, you know, how that reflects, and there might be the postcode lottery for all I know.
I would just add to that, you know, that's why we went to Hackney, and some things, so Leeds and Hackney both stood out as having much better integrated services, and we heard about how well integrated the services were, the other three didn't. So it wasn't as clean as you'd have hoped. Hackney had this massive teacher turnover, but Wolverhampton seemed to as well. So, yeah, I wish we had easier answers. Is there another hand?
So, I was just interested about the slide where you've got the teachers who were saying there's a low aspiration kind of culture, but the young people were really saying, when you asked them, they actually wanted to be doctors or lawyers or whatever it might be. So was there something you uncovered about possibly an unconscious sort of deterministic kind of viewpoint among some of the teachers that didn't connect with the ambitions of the young people?
I think to a certain extent, whenever you talk to someone about being a teacher, often they sometimes think of the best and the worst elements of their experience. And so if you've got a student that got away, you know, that you were really kind of hoping to do it and then kind of just ditched out of school and kind of ended up sort of wandering around and causing trouble, you know, they really stick in the mind. And certainly, you know, there are students who would be described as having low aspirations. We know that at primary school, students often have quite high aspirations, and that, you know, there's a tension between them becoming perhaps more realistic as they start kind of becoming aware of kind of what kind of grades they might get at GCSE and A-level, but also there's potentially that lowering of expectations as well. One of the things that we kind of identified though is that a lot of the students were saying that, you know, I made my GCSE options in year 9, and then at the end of year 10 I got careers advice. You know, and it's like the timing of it, but also arguments about the impartiality as well. You know, the sort of the feeling that, you know, I want to do this, but you know, I'm not really sure that, you know, doing these courses was the ones that are doing it. It's like there are genuine questions, and this isn't just our area. We kind of looked at literature as well, so we're fairly confident that's not just like an artifact. That does reflect something that's going on more broadly.
I definitely say there's a disconnect. So we talk to teachers, particularly in Blackpool, we're like, the kids have got no aspirations. And it's like saying kids have no motivation. As soon as you study the research around motivation, they've got motivation to do something. And it's more to do with these role models and understanding what the steps are to pursue those aspirations. And maybe just for those particular students, understanding that the value of passing their GCSEs, which the teachers were not seeing, but which also the young people were not feeling because that wasn't communicated.
One of the interesting quotes that did come out was, and it came out more than once, was this idea that it's not kids just can't be bothered with school, I'm just going to go on the dole. It's kind of, well, I'm going to go work with my dad. You know, I've already got a job. You know, and so, and again, it's the kind of the role models thing to a certain extent. I mean, evolutionary psychology would say picking your parent as your role model is highly adaptive. They've survived, they've reproduced, and they care about your survival. You know, so very obviously those are the kind of people you adopt. Now, of course, if that's your model of what is a successful adult, then obviously, yeah, if that individual sort of isn't sort of that interested in kind of school, then that's likely to be your attitude.
We got so into role models, we did a mini research review, which is also on that.
It's a bit speculative, really. Something I came across not too long ago, where a school was suggesting that they virtually ask every student what it is they want to do, so you get this long-term plan. Now, I can see sort of pluses and minuses about that. But do you think there's any mileage in that kind of approach? I mean, even if it's from year 7, and knowing you might get some, you know, I want to be a professional footballer, fine, but
you probably get the information from somewhere. I mean, I think what does seem to come across is that very generic approaches to raising aspirations probably are having very limited effect. So if you're relying on that in some way to raise students' kind of, you know, expectations of the future, well, it's probably not, because you shape that through personal connections and through identifiable individuals. We're probably not that influenced. Interestingly, we didn't really draw it up, so we don't want to disappoint you. Did any teachers turn up? Not at all, really, when talking about role models. You know, so
which fits the broader research as well.
Yeah.
If you're a teacher, don't worry, because the kids aren't treating you as a role model anyway.
And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's a solution to this. I mean, I think good starting points would be to start thinking about careers earlier, providing that information, but where possible, and I realise we don't have a complete solution for it, but where possible, make that personal and identifiable rather than kind of generically possible.
In East Leeds, we were told all of the secondary schools that any of the young people that we talked to came from. We talked to people from various different schools. There is no work experience anymore because that time is used to add to GCSE time. Blackpool, they were talking about the way the careers service have been dropped. So even just going back to how things were 6-7 years ago when I was in charge of careers for a school would be like, how come kids don't do work experience? What on earth is that about? Well, and GCSE classes.
Well, and also there are a lot of kids do work experience with their dads, you know, and so it's not really doing the broadening that we might want to.
Martin.
Yeah, I'm going to miss something like this. Did you look at all about kids who just doing the education for the sake of its own sake rather than getting a job at the end of it or anything else? Just, you know, I'm sitting here in my English class.
Yeah, I mean, there were some. I mean, obviously, you know, as you can probably imagine from the number of people we spoke to, we've given you quite a kind of high-level summary. But within that, there was a wide range of responses. As I said, for one kid, their role model was John Locke. You know, it kind of gives you an impression of the kind of extent of the kind of responses that we received. No, I mean, I think a lot of it really was quite instrumental. I mean, the majority of the kinds of things when you're talking to kids about the future. Some of them said, I want to be happy, I've got a bucket list, you know, there are things I want to go and visit other countries, and yeah, in terms of their what they want for the future. But the vast majority of them talked about jobs and careers that they wanted to go on to do. And that's true kind of for primary school children as much as the secondary.
I wonder if you came across a sense of sometimes violence of raising aspirations in there's a toxic thing that tears people away from one set of ideological driven in the sense that the aspirations of the school might be very different from the aspirations of the community, and then you come across that sense of mismatch and violence.
There's some really interesting, I mean, the
East Leeds one was particularly interesting because we spent time at a community radio station and we talked to young people who essentially had, so in this area that we are hearing, it's quite working class and most parents in the community don't value education. We talked to a handful of people who had gone on to university and they were fascinating about the tension that caused for them in terms of choosing your friends, choosing that meant your teachers were going to be your friends and you're going to sit on your own, or the pressure you were under in school not to go ahead with that. And then there's an amazing anecdote about someone who goes off to university, struggles in her first term, parents, the person said, parents, lovely parents, they loved her, they were like, come home, we'll look after you. And so, yes, it is two completely different ways of being, and definitely for me, I had to do a lot of sort of introspection on, should everyone do that? Should we just, you know, yeah.
But also a lot of talk about whether people would stay in their community as well. So
especially in Wales.
Yeah.
So lots of people say, you know, you're born here, you die here, I wouldn't want to leave Wales. I'd go to Cardiff for uni. And also talking to teachers who are like, yeah, I went and I swore I'd never come back. But actually, 6-7 years later, I missed it. And now I come back to teach in Wales. Sorry.
No, well, that's not yeah.
Did you find, because I'm a school teacher in Stoke-on-Trent, we have a big issue with encouraging people to go to university because of the financial issues with that. Did that come up much about them not really wanting to go to uni? Instead, I can imagine a place like Blackpool, if they can get a job straight away, maybe through that and spend leave university.
Well, I think teachers mentioned that quite a bit, I mean, in terms of the changes in terms of the funding. And a couple of students mentioned it, but actually, broadly, a lot of the students who are talking about those kinds of careers and kind of, you know, professional aspirations, part of it might come down to the kind of the quality of information they're getting around kind of like the careers. I think it can be very easy to scare children about the kind of the costs of these things and kill some of those aspirations early. And certainly, there was sort of talk of, in Hackney there was an example of, so-and-so went off to university, they've got this massive debt, and now they're struggling to find a job, and I'm not going to do that, I'm going to go down a different route. So, and again, it's personal connections is kind of it is. So if your family have a success story of this, that's providing you a role model, and it's not, I don't care about money. On the other hand, if you've got that kind of personal story in your family, it's going to create potentially an additional barrier for somebody who might otherwise have chosen to go to university.
Let's call this the last question.
You're talking about the importance of gender services. When you were talking to the schools where there were good links and gender services, did you find that the schools weren't under so much pressure financially and pastorally with the children because of that, and they were in the areas where they have less gender services?
So Leeds was the big exception here. Leeds do this fascinating thing called the cluster model, where every service that serves young people and families meet together in local areas, and so you bring pupils who you are struggling with to the table, like we're struggling with them, and you've got the housing officer, the police, it's brilliant, it's really great. They still said they were struggling, not enough social care, can't get this, they have no resort, but they did say it is coordinated, and talking to the cluster leaders, they said even if you don't meet the social care threshold, they'll get something, so people get a bit of help. Whereas other places just said nothing. So I think you're always going to want more, aren't you? Because you want the best bits of infinite needs and finite resources. But it seemed like in the coordinated areas they still wanted more, but things were better off. There was much less talk of people falling between the cracks. Whereas in Blackpool, we just heard about people getting referred, and they were like, the threshold is far higher than it needs to be.
Should that be, the social care threshold, should that be not a national, if a child in this area is...
It's interesting. There's been a bit of a case study about Tower Hamlets, and one of the areas of that is talking about their integrated services. Certainly it's investment, but it's also, I think, work on trying to coordinate these as well, which appears to be working in some areas, but not necessarily working as joined up the way in others.
Thank you for being a great audience. Do stick around, or otherwise, thank you very much.